My name is Jonas Midebo. I'm an experienced concept artist working in the AAA game industry. I've worked on several sci-fi titles, such as Gears of War and Halo Wars 2. In this mech design course, we are going to go through a full creative process, starting with brainstorming and thinking of ideas, then fleshing those out in more detail, and then finally ending with a highly detailed line art. You will be using the ideas in the previous lessons and moving forward with them as you go through this course, until you have fleshed out one of your ideas to full execution. We're going to start off our design process by doing quick sketches called thumbnails. The goal of these sketches is going to be to just iterate on ideas and to quickly generate things to work on later. This means we will use a workflow that's not going to be focused on high detail or technical execution, but focused on quickly generating ideas that are interesting enough that you can get inspired by them. The first step of my drawing process will be to make a light gray base. You could do this with a light marker or a pencil, or digitally with just a light gray brush or a brush with very low opacity, as shown in this simplified example. I'm sketching the shapes in 3 dimensions while mentally picturing the overall space it would take in perspective. It can be helpful to draw a bounding box in perspective, as shown here, to serve as a guide for yourself as you're drawing. As I'm sketching, I'm trying to quickly explore interesting proportional relationship between shapes. While I'm doing this, I'm essentially breaking it down in 2 different objects. One is body parts and the second is limbs. I try and find some interesting arrangement between these that I feel will be interesting, either from a shape perspective or from a function perspective. I try and find interesting relationships between these 2 that are either interesting me in terms of shape or interesting me in terms of function. I'm mentally keeping track of the perspective by sometimes drawing guidelines just to keep me on track. This can especially be helpful in establishing the symmetry on a mech. Since I'm trying to generate ideas, I'm only loosely thinking of the function, and I'm more focused on generating interesting shapes or pushing the boundaries of how I want to arrange things. In this specific thumbnail, I've pushed the knee joint all the way back, trying to create a more interesting leg silhouette. And I've decided to make him asymmetric with a main body that has just one crane-like arm at the side. I've also added a small camera on top, again placed asymmetrically, as its main way of perceiving the world. It's also good at this stage to think of which shapes you want to be dominant. You can achieve this by making some of the shapes more chunky, or you can play with the scale relationships of objects. Finished with the light buildup, I now go to the second step of my process. This is to take this light buildup and then draw over it with line art. I'll be focusing on cutting in and extruding some of the shapes for added visual interest, and to quickly sketch out some of the details just to have enough explanatory detail to know what they are supposed to represent. An important thing to keep in mind when doing this pass is that you want to be loose and insinuative. You don't want to get bogged down in trying to make the drawing too nice or feeling like you're stiffening up because you're trying to draw too precisely. You can either draw shapes like they're primitives, drawing them like simple blocks and simple cylinders with quick loose lines, or you could choose to just draw more impressionistic, insinuative lines that might hint at detail but don't have a lot of accuracy to them. I've personally gravitated towards the latter of those 2. In an effort to keep myself from getting too detailed or getting too bogged down in being precise, I have selected a thicker pen and a more grungy pen, which disallows me from getting too accurate or too detailed. As stated earlier, a lot of what I'm doing when I'm doing these lines is that I'm trying to make the shapes that I've drawn more interesting or to clearly showcase what I liked about the original shape that I drew. A lot of this base is that I was thinking of ideas as I was doing it, and now I'm trying to point them out for later reference. That means that a lot of this line art's function is to explain what I was thinking with this original very, very loose base so that I can reference it for later, or that other people could see what I was thinking with this thumbnail. With my loose lines, I'm going over the functional elements that I'd thought of, like for example, the knee joints, the size of the feet, and the way that the arm connects to the body. And I'm going through some of the main shapes that I felt gave it identity in my base. still in the same vein of brainstorming and thinking of ideas, I'm also adding some quick little details as sort of placeholders to kind of experiment and play around with what I could do with this design. Some of those details are negative spaces that I'm adding, certain layering of shapes that I think look interesting, and adding some functional details like small cables and a little headlight at the front. I'm not very committed to any of the specific details or shapes that I'm drawing at the moment. They're more there to make me excited about the thumbnail than to be exactly explanatory of what I want to do later. However, if you draw a detail in this loose phase that you do really like, you can always bring it over to the next phases of design. Don't feel like you have to get everything right at this phase. This is just for exploration. This means that you can either remove things or completely change things later on, if you so desire. After I've done these loose lines, I'm doing a contour outline over the entire drawing just for readability. Since it's just a small and loose sketch, trying to get the overall silhouette and shape to read, it's helpful to think of it as something that you should be able to see as a small little sketch from afar and still recognize the overall shape. I'm helping that process by just drawing this figure outline, and to add some lines in overlaps of shapes just to clarify where they sit in space. For example, I'm outlining the crane arm more specifically so that it's more clear that it sits in front of the body in this drawing instead of being merged with it. As an extra aesthetic thing that I've decided to do for my thumbnails here, I've given it a quick gray fill-in. You could achieve this by getting a marker, like a number 3 or number 4 neutral gray marker, cold or warm gray, and then essentially fill in the entire silhouette with this color. You could also achieve this just by shading it with, for example, watercolor, or you could try and use pencil, any media really you want that could create a flat gray fill. Then I've taken some white and I've highlighted some of the edges and created a bit of soft lighting just to make a more clear read of the shapes. This was entirely optional, but if you do want to get a similar effect, you can do this, for example, with white pencil or white paint. I've used a fairly detailed drawing style for these, but this is not mandatory. It is entirely okay to have far looser sketches than this to explore in thumbnails. A lot of artists will have very loose sketches at this phase, since the actual drawing quality is completely not important. As a secondary example, I've made another thumbnail that uses a simpler drawing style. In this one, I used the simple perspective bounding box to draw in, and I approached the drawing of the shapes far more as primitives. When doing a thumbnail like this, you can also start by drawing a 2-dimensional drawing first, side view, front or top view of the mech, to kind of get your ideas going before you jump in perspective. It can sometimes be hard to draw in perspective and also think of ideas, so if you're finding that you're having struggles with this, this is a good extra step to do. As I had mentioned earlier, you can also draw shapes just as primitives to speed yourself up. This is an example of that kind of approach. I've also outlined this one, similar like the previous one, this time however focusing on just the standard outline and not going in as much line weight detail. I've also done the extra gray fill-in and white highlight, but this time I've again simplified it to be far more focused on just primitives instead of trying to insinuate a lot of additional detail. The task for this lesson will be to draw a thumbnail that you would be happy with to move forward, and flesh out as a more detailed drawing. You can do additional sketches before starting the thumbnail, like drawing flat perspective drawings or doing very quick small doodles or scribbles to get ideas. But for this course, I would like you to then translate that into perspective.